The woman everyone assumed was just another drunk executive nearly got arrested that night. And the only person who treated her with dignity was the widowed mechanic standing beside an aging pickup truck in a grocery store parking lot. Ethan Carter had finished a 12-hour shift at the repair shop and was loading discounted groceries into the back of his truck when he noticed the commotion. A luxury black sedan sat crooked across two parking spaces beneath the harsh parking lot lights. A well-dressed woman leaned against the driver's door, clearly distressed, her expensive heels unsteady on the wet pavement. Several people watched. Some filmed with their phones. Others whispered. One man laughed. Nobody asked if she was okay. Ethan glanced at the clock. His daughter would be waiting at home. He still had to stop by the pharmacy before it closed. Yet something about the woman's expression made him pause. It was not arrogance. It was exhaustion. The kind that lived deep behind the eyes. "Ma'am, do you have someone who can pick you up?" he asked quietly. The woman looked at him as though she had forgotten how to answer simple questions. I cannot drive." Her voice cracked. Ethan nodded. No judgment. No lecture. He simply took out his phone. 20 minutes later, after several unsuccessful calls from her contact list, he helped her into the passenger seat of his pickup truck and arranged for a local towing company to secure her vehicle overnight. The rain tapped softly against the windshield as they drove through the small Ohio town. The woman drifted in and out of sleep. At one red light she whispered a name. "Mom." Then after a long pause, "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan said nothing. Some grief belonged to people until they were ready to share it. When they finally arrived at a large home on the edge of town, porch lights glowed against the darkness. A gray-haired woman opened the door before Ethan even reached the front steps. Relief flooded her face. "Charlotte." The older woman hurried forward. The name meant nothing to Ethan. He was focused on making sure the younger woman reached the house safely. Together they guided her inside. Before leaving, Ethan noticed something unusual hanging near the entryway. A framed photograph. The picture was old, probably 20 years old. Two young women stood smiling beside a church parking lot, after what looked like a community fundraiser. One of them was clearly the older woman. The other made Ethan stop breathing for half a second. It looked remarkably like his late wife, Emma. Not identical, but close enough to stir something deep inside him. He looked again. Then Charlotte's mother gently turned the frame toward the wall while helping her daughter down the hallway. The motion seemed automatic, almost protective. Ethan left without mentioning it. Outside, the cold air felt sharper. He climbed into his pickup truck and drove toward home. His modest house sat on a quiet street lined with mailboxes and maple trees. The kitchen light was still on. His 10-year-old daughter, Lily, sat at the table finishing homework. Beside her rested a utility bill, a half-finished science project, and a note Ethan had written before work that morning. "Sorry I'm late," he said. Lily smiled immediately. "Did you help somebody again?" Ethan laughed softly and set a paper pharmacy bag on the counter. "Something like that." While Lily returned to her homework, Ethan opened the mailbox outside and collected the day's mail. Among the envelopes was one addressed in handwriting he did not recognize. No return address. No stamp from a local sender. Just his name. Ethan Carter. He stared at it for several seconds beneath the porch light. Something about it felt strangely familiar. Inside the house, Lily called his name. Ethan slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket and walked back inside. He had no idea that the woman he had driven home, the photograph near her doorway, and the mysterious letter now resting against his chest were all connected to a secret his late wife had taken to her grave. The mysterious envelope remained untouched on the kitchen counter until long after Lily had gone to bed. Ethan Carter sat alone beneath the warm glow of a single overhead light, listening to the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of rain against the windows. The house was small, but it held memories in every corner. A framed photograph of Emma stood beside the coffee maker. Her smile seemed frozen somewhere between yesterday and a lifetime ago. Ethan finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded note and an old photograph. His breath caught immediately. The photograph showed Emma standing beside the same gray-haired woman he had seen the night before at Charlotte's house. They looked younger, happier. Behind them stood a church sign from another town nearly 200 miles away. On the back of the photograph, written in Emma's handwriting, were 4 words. If needed, find Margaret. Ethan stared at the message for a long time. Margaret. The name meant nothing to him. Yet somehow Emma had expected it would someday matter. The next morning arrived before he had answers. Ethan was already awake by 5:30. Love does not. At the repair shop the day moved quickly. Customers came and went. Engines rattled. Tools clanged against concrete floors. Around lunchtime, a longtime customer arrived with a broken-down truck and admitted he could not afford the full repair bill until the following month. Ethan quietly completed the work anyway. His boss frowned at first but eventually looked away. It was difficult to stay angry at someone who always seemed to put people ahead of profit. Yet Ethan's own situation was becoming harder. Later that afternoon, another utility bill arrived in the mailbox outside his house. The amount was larger than expected. Medical expenses from Lily's asthma treatments earlier that year still lingered. Halfway through the meal his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost ignored it. Almost. Mr. Carter? A woman's voice asked. My name is Margaret Whitmore. Ethan felt his grip tighten around the phone. The diner suddenly seemed quieter. I believe, the woman continued softly, we need to talk about your wife. Across the booth, Lily was still smiling as she dipped a French fry into ketchup, completely unaware that the answer to a mystery buried for years had just reached across the distance and found her father. Then Margaret spoke a second sentence that made Ethan's heart stop. Emma once asked me to keep a promise if anything ever happened to her. And for the first time since losing his wife, Ethan realized there were parts of Emma's life he had never known. The call with Margaret Whitmore lasted less than 10 minutes, yet it stayed with Ethan Carter for days. She refused to explain everything over the phone. Some stories deserve to be told face to face, she said gently before asking if they could meet the following Saturday. Ethan agreed, though uncertainty followed him everywhere afterward. Emma had been gone for 6 years. He thought he knew every chapter of her life. Now he was no longer certain. The next few days passed in the familiar rhythm of responsibility. Before sunrise each morning, Ethan packed Lily's lunches and left encouraging notes beside her cereal bowl. After dropping her off at school in his aging pickup truck, he spent long hours at the repair shop. Yet even while replacing transmissions and diagnosing engine problems, part of his mind kept returning to the photograph and Emma's handwritten message. If needed, find Margaret. What had Emma known that he did not? On Thursday afternoon, Ethan arrived at Cedar Ridge Elementary for pickup. The school hallway buzzed with children carrying backpacks and art projects. Lily emerged holding a flyer. Family Community Day, she announced proudly. Everyone is supposed to bring someone special. Ethan smiled. Then I guess I better clear my schedule. Lily laughed and slipped her hand into his. Neither noticed the black SUV parked across the lot. Charlotte Whitmore sat behind the wheel, reviewing emails before heading to another meeting. Since the night Ethan had brought her home, she had remembered him only occasionally, mostly as a decent man who happened to show kindness when others looked away. But as she glanced up from her phone, she saw him kneeling beside Lily. One strap on the girl's backpack had torn loose. Without hesitation, Ethan pulled a small sewing kit from his glove compartment and repaired it right there in the parking lot. Lily watched with complete trust. The repair took less than 2 minutes. When he finished, he handed the backpack back as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Charlotte found herself watching longer than necessary. Most people made time for important things. Ethan seemed to make important things out of small moments. Saturday arrived with bright skies and cool autumn air. The church parking lot hosting Family Community Day filled with folding tables, food booths, and children racing between activities. Ethan volunteered to help set up before the event officially began. While unloading supplies, he noticed an elderly volunteer struggling to carry boxes. He quietly stepped over and helped without being asked. A little later, he fixed a broken canopy frame that threatened to collapse over one of the booths. Again, he never mentioned it afterward. Charlotte arrived unexpectedly with her mother. Margaret had insisted on attending. Ethan recognized them immediately. For a brief moment, Charlotte looked uncomfortable. Memories of the night she had been too intoxicated to drive were still fresh. Ethan spared her any embarrassment. He simply greeted them politely and returned to helping children set up games. That simple courtesy surprised her. Many people would have used the moment to make her feel awkward. He chose kindness instead. As the afternoon continued, Charlotte noticed something else. Children naturally drifted toward Ethan. Parents trusted him. Volunteers relied on him. Not because he demanded attention, but because he quietly solved problems wherever he found them. Then came a moment neither of them expected. Lily tripped while carrying craft supplies and dropped everything across the pavement. Before Ethan could reach her, Charlotte was already helping gather scattered papers. For the first time, the two stood side by side, working together for the same child. Lily smiled at both of them. The moment lasted only seconds, yet something shifted. Charlotte suddenly understood why her mother had wanted to meet this man. And as Margaret watched from a nearby table, her eyes filled with emotion. Because hidden inside her purse was a small wooden box that had belonged to Emma Carter, and before the day was over, she intended to reveal the secret she had protected for years. Margaret Whitmore never got the chance to open the wooden box that afternoon. Just as she approached Ethan, her phone rang. The expression on her face changed immediately. A problem at one of Charlotte's company facilities required urgent attention, and within minutes both women were preparing to leave the church parking lot. Before getting into the SUV, Margaret looked back at Ethan with obvious regret. "Soon," she promised. "You deserve to know the truth." Then they were gone. The unfinished conversation lingered like an unanswered question. Ethan spent the rest of the afternoon helping clean up tables and loading supplies into volunteer vehicles. By evening, he and Lily stopped at their usual diner. The familiar waitress greeted them by name and refilled their drinks without asking. Lily chatted happily about the event while Ethan listened, though part of his attention remained fixed on Margaret's words. "You deserve to know the truth." The phrase followed him home. The following week brought an unexpected complication. News spread through town that Charlotte Whitmore had been seen spending time around community events where Ethan volunteered. Small towns often filled silence with assumptions. Some people began whispering that Ethan was trying to get close to the wealthy CEO. Others suggested he was looking for financial help. The rumors annoyed Lily more than they bothered Ethan. One afternoon outside the school hallway, she overheard two parents making comments near the pickup lane. "Funny how often he shows up wherever the CEO is now." The word stung. Lily lowered her eyes and walked away before they saw her. Ethan learned about the incident later that evening. He never confronted anyone. Instead, he sat beside Lily at the kitchen table while she worked on homework. "People do not always know the whole story," he said gently. "That does not mean we stop doing the right thing." The answer did not erase her hurt, but it reminded her why she trusted him. The next morning, another utility bill arrived in the mailbox. Ethan placed it beside several others waiting in a drawer. Money remained tight. Work hours had been inconsistent recently, and Lily's upcoming asthma specialist appointment would add more expenses. Yet later that same day, when an elderly neighbor's lawnmower broke down, Ethan spent part of his lunch break repairing it free of charge. By the time he returned to the repair shop, he had lost an hour of paid work. He never mentioned it to anyone. Charlotte, meanwhile, found herself increasingly conflicted. At first, she dismissed the local gossip as meaningless. Then one of her executives made a careless remark during a meeting. People like that always want something eventually. Charlotte surprised herself with the sharpness of her response. "You do not know him." The room fell silent. The words escaped before she could stop them, because the truth was becoming harder to ignore. Everything she had personally witnessed pointed in the opposite direction. Ethan never asked for favors, never hinted at money, never seemed interested in her status. Still, doubt lingered around the edges. Why had her mother hidden this connection to Emma for so many years? What exactly had they shared? Several days later, Ethan finally received a call from Margaret. They arranged to meet at a quiet coffee shop on Saturday morning. For the first time, it seemed the answers might finally be within reach. But when Saturday arrived, Ethan pulled into the parking lot and immediately sensed something was wrong. Margaret's car was there. Charlotte's was not. Through the front window, he could see Margaret sitting alone at a corner table. The wooden box rested in front of her. And judging by the tears already visible in her eyes, whatever waited inside was far more painful than either of them had expected. The coffee shop was nearly empty when Ethan Carter walked inside that Saturday morning. Soft music played overhead, and sunlight filtered through the front windows onto polished wooden tables. Margaret Whitmore sat alone in the corner exactly where he had seen her from the parking lot. The small wooden box rested in front of her. She looked older than she had at the church event, as though carrying the weight of a memory for too many years had finally become exhausting. Ethan took a seat across from her. For several moments neither spoke. Then Margaret slid the box toward him. Inside were letters, photographs, and a small leather journal. Ethan recognized the journal immediately. It belonged to Emma. His hands trembled as he lifted it. "She left this with me 6 months before she passed," Margaret said softly. She was afraid there might come a day when Lily needed to understand who her father really was. Ethan frowned. "Lily knows who I am." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "No, Ethan. She knows what you did after Emma got sick. She never knew what you gave up before that." The words landed harder than he expected. Slowly, Margaret explained the secret she and Emma had protected. Years ago, before Ethan became a mechanic, he had received an opportunity to join a prestigious engineering program with a major manufacturing company in another state. The position would have changed their lives financially. Emma had wanted him to go. But when complications arose during her pregnancy with Lily, Ethan quietly declined the opportunity without telling anyone outside his family. He stayed because Emma was frightened and needed support. Later, when Lily was born with medical challenges, he never reconsidered the decision. The engineering company eventually moved on. Ethan moved forward with his family. Margaret opened one of Emma's letters. Inside was a passage written shortly before her death. She described Ethan waking before dawn to care for Lily, working long shifts, sleeping in hospital waiting rooms, and never once speaking about the future he had surrendered. "He thinks sacrifice means giving something up," Emma had written. "What he never sees is that he gives people a reason to feel safe." Ethan lowered his eyes. Across the room, other customers chatted over coffee, unaware that an entire chapter of his life was being returned to him. Later that afternoon, Ethan stopped at the grocery store before heading home. The journal remained on the passenger seat of his pickup truck. He kept glancing at it during red lights. For years, he had viewed those choices as simple responsibilities. Hearing them described through Emma's eyes made them feel different. Not heroic, just meaningful. Meanwhile, Margaret shared part of the story with Charlotte. They sat together in Margaret's kitchen while old photographs covered the table. Charlotte listened quietly. The revelation changed something inside her. Every act of kindness she had witnessed suddenly connected into a larger picture. Ethan's patience with Lily, his refusal to seek attention, his habit of helping people despite his own struggles. None of it was accidental. It was the result of years spent choosing others before himself. That evening, Charlotte drove past Ethan's neighborhood on her way home. She noticed him outside beside a mailbox, helping an elderly neighbor carry groceries up the front steps. He did not know anyone was watching. He was simply being himself. For the first time, Charlotte felt something deeper than admiration. It was respect. The kind built on character rather than circumstances. Yet the biggest discovery was still waiting. As Ethan read further into Emma's journal that night after Lily fell asleep, a folded page slipped from between the entries. Attached was an old photograph he had never seen before. Emma and Margaret stood together outside a hospital waiting room. On the back, Emma had written a single sentence. "If Lily ever asks about the promise, tell her the truth." Ethan stared at the words, because he had never heard Emma mention any promise. And suddenly, the mystery surrounding her final years had become even larger than before. The photograph and Emma's handwritten words stayed with Ethan Carter long after midnight. He sat alone at the kitchen table while the rest of the house slept, the leather journal open beside a stack of utility bills and school paperwork. "If Lily ever asks about the promise, tell her the truth." The sentence echoed in his mind. Yet no matter how many pages he reread, Emma never explained what promise she meant. The mystery that had begun with a single photograph now felt tied to something much larger. By morning, there was no time to dwell on it. Lily had school. Life still demanded attention. Ethan packed her lunch, repaired a loose wheel on her science project, and drove her to school in his aging pickup truck. At the drop-off lane, he noticed a mother struggling to unload supplies while managing two small children. Without hesitation, he stepped over and carried the boxes into the school hallway before heading to work. The gesture took less than 3 minutes. Yet by lunchtime, 3 different teachers had mentioned his help. Ethan never heard any of those conversations. At the repair shop, pressure continued building. A regional supplier had made an error that left several customers waiting for critical parts. Tempers rose. Schedules slipped. Ethan quietly reorganized the workflow, found alternative solutions, and kept repairs moving without creating conflict. Even his manager seemed surprised. "How do you always figure this stuff out?" he asked. Ethan shrugged and returned to work. Hidden beneath the grease-stained uniform was the same man who once earned admission into a prestigious engineering program. He never talked about it. Most people assumed he was simply good with tools. Meanwhile, Charlotte found herself thinking about him far more often than she expected. After learning about the sacrifices he made for Emma and Lily, she started noticing details she had overlooked before. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Every place she encountered Ethan, things seemed better after he left. At the grocery store, he helped an overwhelmed cashier fix a jammed register line. At a community fundraiser, he repaired electrical problems that would have shut down half the event. At school functions, children naturally gathered around him because he listened. It was stewardship, responsibility, quiet leadership. A few days later, another challenge arrived. Lily experienced a serious asthma flare-up during gym class. The school called Ethan immediately. Within minutes, he left work and drove straight to the clinic. Hours passed in a hospital waiting room while doctors monitored her breathing. Ethan never left her side. He missed the remainder of his shift and lost income he could not easily afford to lose. Yet when Lily finally smiled and said she felt better, relief washed across his face so completely that the sacrifice seemed irrelevant. Charlotte happened to be at the same medical center visiting Margaret after a routine appointment. Through a hallway window, she saw Ethan sitting beside Lily, helping her finish homework while medical equipment quietly hummed nearby. He looked exhausted, yet his attention never drifted from his daughter. Charlotte stood there longer than she intended. Something about the scene unsettled her in the best possible way. It reminded her of everything success could never replace. Later that evening, Margaret called Ethan. Her voice sounded unusually serious. "I found something else among Emma's papers," she said. "Something I should have shown you years ago." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. Outside, the mailbox at the edge of his driveway stood beneath the fading sunset. Inside the house, Lily laughed at a television show, unaware another piece of her mother's hidden story was about to emerge. Then Margaret added 6 words that changed everything. The promise was never about Emma. Margaret's words echoed through Ethan Carter's mind long after the call ended. The promise was never about Emma. That single sentence transformed years of assumptions into questions. The following evening, after finishing work and helping Lily with a school project at the kitchen table, Ethan drove to Margaret's house. The same home where he had first delivered Charlotte on that rainy night now felt connected to a much deeper chapter of his life. Margaret greeted him at the door carrying a large envelope filled with old documents. Charlotte was there as well, seated quietly beside her mother. For the first time, all 3 sat together not as strangers linked by coincidence, but by a story waiting to be uncovered. Margaret carefully unfolded a letter written in Emma's handwriting. Years earlier, when Lily was still a toddler and Emma's health had begun to decline, she had volunteered at a family support program hosted through a regional hospital. That was where she met Margaret. At the time, Charlotte's father had recently passed away, leaving Margaret to raise her grieving daughter while managing overwhelming responsibilities. During one difficult season, Charlotte nearly abandoned her college plans to stay home and help her mother. Emma had learned about the situation. Then she did something almost no one knew. She quietly convinced Ethan to use money they had been saving for a down payment on a larger home to help fund a scholarship program through the Hospital Community Foundation. The scholarship eventually helped several struggling families, including Charlotte's family during a critical year. Ethan stared at the documents in disbelief. He remembered the money. He remembered giving up the house. What he had forgotten was how determined Emma had been to help others despite their own challenges. The promise, Margaret explained through tears, was that if Charlotte ever learned where that support came from, I would tell her the truth about the people behind it. Charlotte lowered her eyes. For years she had believed anonymous donors had changed her family's future. Now she was learning that behind those sacrifices stood two ordinary people already carrying burdens of their own. Yet the revelation did more than honor Emma. It revealed something about Ethan. Emma's letters described how he agreed to every sacrifice without hesitation. The engineering opportunity, the house, the savings, the long nights in hospital waiting rooms. Again and again he chose family, compassion, and responsibility over personal ambition. Meanwhile, outside the house, autumn winds rattled the mailbox near the curb. Inside, silence settled over the room. Charlotte looked at Ethan differently now. Not because he had once possessed opportunities, not because he had given away money, but because every story pointed toward the same truth. His character never changed regardless of circumstances. Whether he had little or much, he measured success by the people he could protect. Over the following week, that truth began quietly spreading through the community. Margaret shared parts of Emma's story with a few longtime friends, teachers who knew Lily, volunteers from the church parking lot events. People started understanding that Ethan's kindness was not random. It was a way of life. Yet not everyone accepted the story. Some remained skeptical. Others assumed details had been exaggerated over time. Ethan himself disliked the attention. He continued showing up at work, helping neighbors, and sharing Thursday dinners with Lily at their favorite diner as though nothing had changed. But one evening, as they sat in their usual booth, Lily asked a question that stopped him cold. "Dad, what was the promise Mom wanted someone to tell me about?" Ethan looked across the table at his daughter. For the first time, the mystery was no longer about the past. It was about what Lily deserved to know. And as he searched for the right answer, he realized the hardest part of the story still had not been revealed. Lily's question lingered between them long after the diner grew quiet. Ethan Carter looked across the booth at his daughter and realized there was no longer a simple way to protect her from the truth. For years he had carried difficult things so she would not have to. Medical worries, financial stress, grief. Now another burden stood at the door. A promise connected to her mother. "I need a little more time," he said gently. Lily nodded, but disappointment flickered across her face before she looked down at her plate. It was a small reaction. Yet Ethan felt it immediately. Trust was built one honest moment at a time. And for the first time, he worried that keeping secrets might be hurting the very person he was trying to protect. The following week became one of the hardest he had faced in years. At work, reduced hours forced him to pick up additional repair jobs during evenings and weekends. Utility bills continued arriving in the mailbox with uncomfortable regularity. Lily's school expenses, household costs, and everyday responsibilities stretched every dollar. Yet none of that felt as heavy as the distance quietly forming between him and his daughter. She was not angry. That almost made it worse. She simply became quieter, more thoughtful. One afternoon when Ethan arrived at school, he spotted Lily sitting alone in the hallway after classes ended. Usually she greeted him with stories about her day before they even reached the pickup truck. This time she smiled politely and followed him outside. The change was subtle, but fathers noticed those things. Meanwhile, Charlotte found herself increasingly concerned. During a community event at the church parking lot, she saw Lily standing apart from the other children. After a brief conversation, Charlotte realized the girl was carrying questions nobody seemed able to answer. Questions about her mother. Questions about promises. Questions about why adults always waited until children were older before telling them important truths. Charlotte understood more than Lily realized. She had spent years wishing her own parents had shared certain truths sooner. Yet she also understood Ethan's fear. Love sometimes made people hesitate when honesty hurt. Days later, another complication arrived. While sorting through Emma's journal, Ethan discovered a sealed envelope addressed to Lily. The handwriting was unmistakably Emma's. His heart raced as he stared at it at the kitchen table. For several minutes he considered opening it. Not out of curiosity, out of fear. Fear of what it might contain. Fear of what it might change. In the end, he placed the envelope back inside the journal. The letter belonged to Lily. But he still was not ready. That night, Lily accidentally saw it. She had entered the room looking for a school permission slip. Her eyes immediately found her mother's handwriting. Then she noticed Ethan quietly placing the journal away. Neither spoke at first. The silence felt enormous. "That was from Mom, wasn't it?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "And you did not tell me?" The hurt in her voice cut deeper than any accusation. Before he could explain, Lily turned away and walked to her room. The bedroom door closed softly. Not slammed. Not angrily. Just closed. Yet the sound echoed through the house. Ethan remained alone at the kitchen table long after midnight. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. A stack of bills sat untouched nearby. None of those worries mattered now. The thing he treasured most was slipping beyond his reach. Across town, Charlotte received a late-night call from Margaret. The older woman's voice trembled. "I found the final letter," she whispered. "The one Emma never wanted hidden." Charlotte closed her eyes. Because if Margaret was right, the truth inside that letter could either heal everything or break what remained. And by morning, Ethan would have to decide whether protecting Lily meant finally letting her see the truth he had been afraid to face himself. The next morning, Ethan Carter sat at the kitchen table before sunrise with Emma's journal, Lily's unopened letter, and the final envelope Margaret had discovered. The house was silent except for the ticking of an old wall clock. For years he had believed protecting his daughter meant carrying every burden himself. Now he understood something different. Trust required truth. When Lily finally came into the kitchen, her eyes still carried the hurt from the night before. Ethan pulled out the chair beside him. "You deserve to know everything," he said quietly. Then he handed her the letter. Lily opened it with trembling hands. Emma's words filled the room. She wrote about love, courage, and family. She explained that the promise was never about money, scholarships, or hidden favors. The promise was about Ethan. If Lily ever grew old enough to question whether she had missed out because her father stayed behind, Emma wanted her to know the truth. She described the engineering career he walked away from, the opportunities he declined, the house they never bought, and the dreams he quietly surrendered so his family would never face hardship alone. "Your father will never tell you what he gave up," Emma wrote, "because he never sees sacrifice as something special. But one day I need you to understand that every choice he made was an expression of love." Tears rolled down Lily's cheeks. Across the table, Ethan lowered his eyes. For the first time, he was hearing Emma's words through his daughter's ears. Later that afternoon, Margaret invited them to a community gathering at the same church parking lot, where so many pieces of the story had begun to connect. Families, teachers, neighbors, and volunteers filled the space. Charlotte stood beside her mother near a small stage set up for community announcements. Ethan almost declined the invitation. He disliked attention. Yet Lily asked him to come. So he did. During the event, Margaret stepped forward holding Emma's journal. The crowd gradually quieted. She spoke not about donations or old secrets but about character. About people whose lives changed communities without seeking recognition. Then she told the story. The scholarship fund. The sacrifices. The years Ethan spent caring for Emma and Lily. The opportunities he gave away without regret. The kindness he continued extending even when life was difficult. A silence settled across the church parking lot. Not the silence of discomfort. The silence of understanding. Teachers remembered the help he offered at school. Neighbors remembered repaired mailboxes and late-night assistance. Families remembered community events saved by his quiet efforts. Piece by piece, people realized they had all benefited from the same thing. Ethan's character. Charlotte watched him standing beside Lily, visibly uncomfortable with the attention. That alone seemed to prove every word was true. Emotional justice arrived not through applause, but through recognition. The truth finally caught up to the man who never asked for credit. Then Lily stepped forward unexpectedly. She held Emma's letter against her chest and looked at her father. "You kept every promise," she said softly. The words reached him more deeply than anything else that day. For a moment neither moved. Then Ethan opened his arms and Lily ran into them. Years of grief, questions, and uncertainty seemed to soften in that embrace. Nearby, more than one person wiped away tears. As the gathering ended, families slowly returned to conversations and laughter. Children played near the folding tables. Evening sunlight painted everything gold. Whatever came next would grow naturally from that foundation. Weeks later, life remained ordinary in many ways. Utility bills still arrived in the mailbox. Ethan still drove the same pickup truck. He still packed lunches and left handwritten notes for Lily before school. Yet something had changed. The weight he carried alone for so long was lighter now. Not because his responsibilities disappeared, but because the people around him finally understood them. One Thursday evening at their favorite diner, Lily unfolded one of his lunch notes and smiled. "You know, Mom was right." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Sometimes redemption arrives softly. Sometimes second chances begin with truth. And sometimes the greatest legacy a person leaves behind is helping the people they love finally see the value that was there all along.